Thank you for coming back for part 4 of the Eastport Tower layout construction video. At the end of part 3, most of the industrial switching tracks were in place up above the main line, and that includes the hopper car storage tracks by the power plant. On the left is the scenery by the main line that was put in last time, and now we're moving up to the upper level for the much more challenging scenery to be put in there. And the backdrop pieces can be taken out or put in easily, which is very helpful. I wanted to avoid that pool table look for the ground on the upper level because it's never really like that in the real world. I started out on the right end by the power plant and then worked my way to the left about 20 feet. And so the power plant ground had felt put down to go around and between the tracks, and the first ground cover materials were mixed and put in, including some blackened material between the rails where presumably some coal had fallen out of the hoppers over the years. There's a gap between the retaining wall and the upper board, so some cardboard and painter's tape was put down to cover that gap, and all of the little landforms, little hills, rises, uneven ground was basically done with newspaper wadded up there and taped down with painter's tape. And this looks at first kind of like a traditional hard shell technique in terms of putting the cardboard strips in. I just glued them together and tacked them until it was dry, but what I'm actually trying here was simply some felt newspaper and then felt on top of it, and then it was going to be sprayed with the weak white glue adhesive to see if that would create a hard enough shell to be convincing as scenery and to hold up. So then, once again, as I had done in previous videos, put down various types of ground cover and start moving them around with a brush, mix different colors, textures, and now it's starting to look a little bit like something. And these tracks are going to be absolutely weed grown, choked with weeds, detritus, and all sorts of messy stuff that it looks like the trains would have a little bit difficult time rolling through, but we'll address that a little bit later. And there you can see a hopper car that looks like it's not even on the rails, but it is. I was experimenting a little bit with some kind of ivy or clinging weeds coming over the lip of the retaining wall, and we'll do much more of that later on, working our way west actually with more of the felt. There's a little one of the joints in the tables, the 6 tables that this can be broken down into for moving if necessary. You can still see the line to the left of the caboose, but the scenery would be used to the ground cover to hide that. Put a couple small hills in there to make it a little bit more interesting. Again, avoid that pool table look. And there will be so much more in terms of weeds, trees, thickets, junk, and so forth to make this look like an industrial area. Over to the top right is the coal dumper building, which still needs to be worked on some, but we'll talk about that. There's a little elevated track going up to it, which you'll see later on. And as you work through this, the main thing with the switches is to try to avoid fouling them with all kinds of cement or ballast or ground cover. I made a little tree just using some garden stuff and some scenery powder. First attempt, it would get better as it went on. And we are working our way further west in the direction of New York. Lots of switches here, and you just got to take it slow, adding in all this scenery stuff and making sure that they all work still smoothly. They're pico switches, so they're sprung. At this point, we acquired some industrial flats. These are actually photographically made. Very nice for some factories here. And when you only have a 3-foot deep visible part of the layout, that really helps with the use of the available space. So there it is up above the main line, and these are pretty ruined looking factories. This is right in the middle of the 20-foot long layout, and there's another seam or joint between the tables, and you can see there's a joint in the retaining wall as well. So we are just moving left, putting in more scenery elements, spraying it with the weak glue solution, put a little hill in there, adding some more trees, again stuff from the garden that had dried out, and going to make those look a little better as we go, but just you'll learn these things by doing. That cardboard there in front of the buildings, we'll come back to that because that's a nice part of the latter part of this video. So we're developing a little scene there above the main line with the power plant, and you can see that that elevated track coming up to the coal dumper is going to be needing scenery still. Sometimes you get a little fatigued working on one element of the layout, so I decided to move way over to the left side where a tunnel that's going to be under a hill. Remember I showed you this video, here's a little piece of it earlier. That's the tunnel portal where you can store a fairly small local freight under the hill, and it can come out and go to the various service tracks. So I put as you see the track curves around, I put the ballast down, I put some tunnel walls like before on the lower level, and some felt, black felt, covered it up. We're trying to block all the light to the tunnel, and that turned out pretty good. One thing I hope to do a little bit on the layout is just reuse some common, otherwise disposable household materials. So I tore up some pieces of shipping styrofoam, and to my astonishment I found that Elmer's glue worked great to hold those together, just to make the shell to go underneath this hill. And now you can see that the tunnel, everything is nice and dark in there, so that when a train is stored back there, it can just kind of come out of nowhere and enter the layout. Here's how those tracks looked in front of the backdrop, the before picture, and now some of the after picture as the scenery keeps working its way down to the left, gluing something down with a paint can there. Very handy. And now I've thrown in all kinds of ballast between the rails and scenery materials outside the rails. And this is a really rough view on the upper level there because there's been no attempt yet. You see how messy this is. The rails need to be freed up and then the rail tops cleaned. And so just worked my way down doing that and sort of rolling some cars to test whether the trains can roll freely on these storage tracks. Nice view in front of some of these industrial buildings. As I said before, the backdrop eventually is not going to be pegboard, but it'll be covered by some sort of sky blue or backdrop art. Don't quite know yet. There is our Eastport Tower down below, and some more of those weeds, which will be beefed up quite a bit, climbing over the retaining wall. When I was planning the layout for a very long period of time, this was one of the things I visualized, was this curving hopper power plant trackage going over the main line and just this long view down. It was nice to see that starting to form. Just grinding further left, westward if you will, on filling in the scenery around these tracks, putting some switch machines in, and then I would add a little structure to this, which is going to go at the end of one of the excess car storage tracks, the ubiquitous Rick's Quonset hut, which once built it looked awfully shiny and new, and that's going to need some rust and all kinds of grime on it. There's a big potential problem here, obviously, with all of these weeds choking the tracks. How does one set it up so that the cars can roll through it well? And you can't use a regular abrasive cleaner for the rail tops. So I designed a little tool by using a file to cut a notch in a small screwdriver, which not only can be used to clear the flangeways inside the rails, but it's a good tool for keeping the rails clean. And now is time for one of those incremental payoffs that come along once in a while as you build your layout. Coming back to that styrofoam support that I'd made for the left-hand tunnel, put some newspaper on top of that, and then some more shipping materials, just sort of crisp cardboard, thin shipping paper there, and glued some of that down with a little light tacking to hold it in place. This is going to be a little bit more like the traditional hard shell. You could use plaster or, paper towels soaked in plaster, but I use the Woodland Scenics. Very convenient cloth. Soak them in water. You lay them on there and they will dry pretty quickly and set up. And overnight, once they have hardened fully, it's a super lightweight, pretty strong thing. That will be removable when necessary if a move were to take place. Just messing around with some buildings there. None of those were going to be permanent in those places. This is one of my favorite things that's been done so far on the railroad, which you see the cardboard strip in front of those buildings. That was left open for a sort of an access road for trucks to come in. Used some gray tile grout. Didn't end up quite as gray as I thought, but I was able to, once I'd sanded it down a bit, I was able to cover it with some gray chalk or black chalk to sort of make it really ugly, beat up, poorly maintained road. And then when you pull up the painter's tape, it's a nice clean border. I also had sketched out some driveway entrances for these buildings and then put some scenery in and some broken rock on some of these defunct factories, and that really improved the outlook. This is one of my favorite views so far. Again, just kind of going with that mental picture I had as I planned the layout. No need to go through that whole process again with the right hand tunnel or the hill there. Kind of the same process. And doing some of this felt and ground cover scenery. Spray the glue stuff on it, and we're starting to look like something. So again, it'll be covered with a lot of extra stuff. So part 5 will get us pretty close to the end of the basic scenery, I think. And then what's going to happen after that? Thank you for watching as always, and I will see you soon.